Today we're going to be beginning a new topic, that of land and water resources. And there's a number of different subtopics under that heading. Today we'll be starting by talking a bit about agriculture, and in particular focusing on some technological advances in agriculture and routes to sustainable agriculture. There are two aspects of agriculture that we're going to begin by defining. The first one has to do with animals. We could call livestock agriculture. And what you're looking at here is a young Guernsey cow. Guernsey cows are one of the common breeds of dairy cattle. And they are usually represented in most dairy herds by at least a few individuals because they produce milk with a rather high butterfat content, and so their milk is often mixed with that of the milk of the big black and white cows, the Holsteins, in order to raise their butterfat content to the level at which dairy farmers want to have their milk at. So that would be livestock agriculture, those kinds of considerations. The other aspect of agriculture involves growing plants, such as these organic peaches you see here, along with some organic pears from my own orchard. Fruit growing is usually referred to as pomology. And if we also consider the growing of vegetables, like these that you see here, that is usually referred to as agronomy. So we could summarize all that like this. That first term, agronomy, referring to growing of plants. And so that other term I used, pomology, would be like a subset of agronomy. But the growing of all other kinds of plants would also fall into this heading. So the growing of grains, the growing of vegetables, root crops, all those sorts of things all fall into the heading of agronomy. So agronomists, people who study agronomy, study things like how to go about producing the best quality and quantity of crops through techniques that we're going to be talking about, like crop rotation and contour farming and irrigation. Some of those we'll be discussing even today. Insect control, other kinds of diseases and things like that that might interfere with the growing of crops. Now, livestock agriculture, in contrast, involves agriculture that revolves around the growing of domesticated animals for the production of meat, or in the case of these chickens that you see here, eggs. These are all egg-laying breeds that you're looking at here, including Plymouth Rocks and Rhode Island Reds and Americanas. The blonde ones are the Americanas. All of them are good egg producers. Although all these breeds are also good meat producers, so they're referred to as multi-purpose breeds. Other kinds of reasons for raising domesticated animals would be as sources of things like animal byproducts, leather, and the bones of animals that have been slaughtered for meat can also be used for crushing into bone meal, which is an organic fertilizer component. Adding calcium to soil can also be used as part of animal feeds. Domesticated animals can also be used for things like sport, in the case of horses. Although horses can also be raised, certain breeds of horses, some of the larger breeds, the draft horses, were raised as beasts of burden. Although both horses and certain breeds of cattle have both been used as beasts of burden. Not so much in the USA anymore, although people still do raise them and some people still do use them for that purpose. But in places like Southeast Asia, certain breeds of cattle are still very commonly used as beasts of burden. Now, of course, in the developed world, the device that replaced beasts of burden was this thing right here, the tractor. And you're looking at a vintage, 1950s era Ford tractor, quite a few of which you still see around. Tractors only get used a few times a year for the most part, intensively at least, and so they tend to last a really long time. So it's very common to see a lot of farms using 50-year-old tractors as their principal workhorses. And there's a very active industry in repairing and restoring these old tractors. A lot of people like these old ones. They are more handsome in some ways than some of the new tractors. And they do tend to be bargains, so people with small farms still like to use these old tractors. You don't see tractors before about 1950 being used very much, however, because before that time there wasn't much standardization. So a lot of the tractors from the 1930s and 40s, although they can still be eminently serviceable, it's harder to find attachments that fit with them. Whereas after about 1950, an innovation called the three-point hitch was developed, in which tractors connected to a whole variety of different kinds of devices like plows and disking devices and things like that, all using the same hookup kind of a mechanism. And so tractors after 1950 do tend to be the most popular. Even the real old ones, again, get used quite a bit as long as they have that three-point hitch attachment. It's very easy to find attachments that have that arrangement, so they're much more practical. Now, the mechanization that tractors brought by the 1940s, especially since then, with some of these vintage kinds of tractors, like in the last image, and this one here also, this little red tractor, I think is probably an old Farmall, also most likely from the 1950s. So these tractors were involved in revolutionizing agriculture. What you could do with a team of horses, you could now do with a tractor like this in a fraction of the time. And so it gave rise to what is often referred to as the Green Revolution, where productivity of agriculture just mushroomed after the 1930s. And mechanization was a big part of that increase in productivity, although other aspects of modern scientific agriculture were also involved. Things like chemical fertilizers becoming widely available, the development of pesticides by the 1930s in a major way. All those kinds of things would have given rise to greatly improved yields of crops. Not that there weren't some problems that came along with all these things too, and we'll be talking about some of those. But the Green Revolution continues to this day with new innovations in agriculture, things like genetic engineering, and let's talk about that a bit. Let's first take a look at this little guy here. This is a young Jersey cow. Jerseys are a smaller breed of cow that was the traditional family cow for small family farms in much of America as well as Europe. They produce enough milk for an extended family. Like the Guernsey, they also tend to be rather high in butterfat content, so you can also do things like make ice cream and skim off cream and things like that with Jersey milk. They're not as they don't produce as many pounds of milk per day as do the large black and white cows, the Holsteins, but they are well suited for a small operation, and they can also be used to increase butterfat content in a herd. My point in showing you this little guy, however, is that using modern genetic techniques, we can improve on a lot of these old breeds of animals, and actually to a greater degree, many of our cultivated varieties of plants. We can do a number of different things that can improve these varieties. Some of them are a bit controversial, but let's talk a little bit more about these kinds of ideas. So we can define genetic engineering as manipulating an organism's genetics. We can insert portions of DNA into an organism that actually originated in another organism. Or we can synthesize new genetic material and insert that into the genome of a plant or an animal. So one technique that can be used to develop new genetic material is through a process called molecular cloning, where we replicate a single DNA molecule to generate many cells with identical DNA. Recombinant DNA technology can make use of this cloning technique to create new sequences of DNA. You have to keep in mind, if you remember back to introductory biology, DNA differs only in the sequence of nucleotides present along it. And so you can use technology like this to introduce new DNA into an organism. And then once this is introduced, it can be replicated along with the rest of the organism's DNA. So it can be passed from one generation to the next. And so you've added certain genetic components to an organism. One can do things like add disease resistance, or pesticide resistance is one that's been done. Making plants immune to herbicides so that herbicides can be used to kill weeds but not affect the crop that you want to grow. Things like that. A lot of work has been done with trying to develop disease resistance in different kinds of agricultural crops. It's also a kind of a process that's used with bacteria. You can, in essence, train bacteria to manufacture certain chemicals for you. So drugs such as insulin and human growth hormone are now produced via genetic engineering. So, for example, if you look at this vegetable operation here, right about in the middle of the field of view, you're looking at tomato plants. Right behind those white flowers, those are all tomatoes. And tomatoes in much of the East have had a big problem in recent years with a fungal disease called late blight, which strikes plants here in the Northeast around August. And within a very short period of time from when it is first detected on the plants, it kills them. And so it can cut the tomato harvest in half or even more. So it's one of these kinds of diseases that plant breeders have been working hard at trying to get disease resistance to. And there's been quite a bit of work at places like the University of North Carolina trying to breed for disease resistance, specifically resistance to late blight. And one of the possible avenues here is to take genes from another plant which have resistance to this kind of fungus and insert them into the genome of tomatoes. Now, in rather arid kinds of climates, like you find grapes growing in Northern California, which is what you're looking at here. These are vineyards where water is at a premium, and you don't want plants to be getting competed with by weeds. Developing plants that have resistance to herbicides can be a real advantage. So if you can breed varieties of plants that have resistance to herbicides, then you can spray between the rows of these plants and kill off all the competing weeds, and then the plants don't have to compete with weeds for the available water, not to mention nutrients in the soil. And so genetic engineering has been used to develop varieties of plants that can do things like that. So these are some of the sorts of things that genetic engineering has been used for: disease resistance, pest resistance, herbicide resistance. Although some crops have been genetically engineered to improve their nutritional value, notably some strains of rice that produce certain nutrients that are not normally available in rice. So, to this day, most genetically modified crops are still grown in the USA. In Europe, they tend to be out of favor. There is some skepticism about these sorts of things in other parts of the world about what a good idea it is to be genetically engineering our food supply. And there have been some negative aspects of all of this that have emerged. So, for example, genes that have been inserted into agricultural crops can escape. You have to remember that plants produce by things like pollen grains, and pollen grains can move from one plant to another, and sometimes genes from these agricultural crops can even get incorporated into weed plants. And we've actually seen that happen, so that certain weeds are now developing herbicide resistance that they've gotten from genetically engineered agricultural crops. That phenomenon called cross-pollination, which in some instances for certain kinds of crops, like a lot of fruit trees, is a good thing. You actually often want to have more than one variety of things like apple trees in an orchard to get cross-pollination happening so that you get better fruit set. But it can also work against you when cross-pollination is bringing unwanted genes into non-agricultural crops. Now let's turn our attention to another issue, the issue of irrigation. You're looking here at a Japanese rice paddy. Notice the dike along the left-hand side, and there is a water control structure that you might be able to pick out about in the middle of the picture. Rice paddies are seasonally flooded. Rice is really a wetland plant, and so periodically it needs to be flooded in order to make it grow. And so in order to do that, you have to have a mechanism to hold the water in place and to deliver the water. And that's what you see in this field here. Now, not all crops need as much water as rice, however. So if we go back to our vineyards in Northern California, here a different kind of a system is used. And if you look along those rows of grapevines, you'll see hoses. And if you could see those hoses more carefully, what you'd see is that they have perforations in them that drip water onto the ground. So it's a very controlled release of water. And this is referred to as drip irrigation. It's a water conservation kind of an approach to delivering water to plants without using excessive amounts of water. Indeed, in arid climates like Northern California, or here we are in the southwestern part of the USA along the Colorado River, water conservation is a real issue. And if you want to grow crops in these more arid kinds of landscapes, techniques have to be implemented so that water can be used and not wasted. So the Colorado River that you see here is very heavily used as a source of irrigation water for agricultural in a good part of the Southwest and even into Mexico. And so its water has to be used judiciously in order for there to be enough for all of its competing uses. Now, of course, people have been irrigating crops long before modern mechanization, and in parts of the world, such as in places in Southeast Asia, like the island of Bali that you are looking at here, the principal means of getting water from one place to another is still gravity. So the island of Bali is a very wet island. It rains a lot there. And by having these terraced rice paddies that you see here, the water can flow from one paddy down the hillside to the next without using any sort of pumping mechanism in order to make that happen. These terraces simply capture the water, and the overflow from one terrace can move to the next terrace. To summarize some of these sorts of irrigation techniques, let's take a look at this slide here. Surface irrigation would be one where water is permitted to flow via gravity across cropland, much like you see in this Balinese rice paddy terrace system. Drip irrigation, you have water drip from pipes onto roots, which minimizes evaporation and runoff. In less arid climates, you can have sprinkler systems where high pressure water is delivered via sprinklers and it's sprayed over crops. So here in New England, we see a lot of this sprinkler kind of a system usage for especially vegetables, those kinds of crops around here. Again, in more arid kinds of climates, you can see center pivot irrigation, where you actually have circular farm fields, where you have an irrigation system that pivots around a central point and sprinkles crops in this circular path, and so you wind up with a circular farm field. Lateral irrigation is a linear system of sprinklers that are attached to wheels. You often see this used in turf farms, places that grow grass for lawns. They'll have these lateral sprinkler systems where they'll actually roll across the field and apply water via that kind of a system. Seepage systems are used where instead of spraying water onto crops, the water level is raised so that it intersects the roots of crops. And that could be done by means of pipes and pumps and canals and that sort of thing. Now, especially in arid climates, irrigation is a real issue, not just in terms of having enough water to put on crops, but also if you irrigate crops insufficiently, what that can do is that water evaporates, is that it can result in salts in the soil being mobilized and deposited on the upper layer of the soil. That actually is what happened in antiquity in places like the Middle East, where through inadequate irrigation, ancient farmers poisoned their farmland with salt from not being able to flush the salts out. So if you are going to use arid environments as agricultural land, there has to be sufficient irrigation to flush that salt from the soil. Now let's end our discussion today by introducing the topic of sustainable agriculture. producing an agricultural system that can persist over time. There is concern that some of our present practices are really unsustainable. There is a finite supply of minerals that can be ground up into mineral fertilizer. There are questions about how many chemicals you can put on agricultural land before their effectiveness declines. And so what kinds of processes can we use to have agricultural productivity be sustained over time? And there's been a great deal of research on this topic. And so let's talk a little bit about some of the kinds of things that fall under this heading. So let's start out by looking at a section of My Little Farm, which illustrates several different aspects of sustainable kinds of procedures. So you notice that big white blanket that runs down one of the rows. That is called a row cover, and it serves several different purposes. They actually come in several different types. There's a heavier one, which is what this one is, that one can put on crops in early spring to hold in heat and make plants grow faster. But by carefully securing row cover to the soil, it also serves another purpose. It serves as a barrier for insect pests in particular. So for example, under this row cover here, I have a crop of cabbages. And cabbages are attacked by cabbage moths beginning in late spring, early summer. But if the cabbages are covered with a row cover, then the cabbage moths can't land on the plants, hence they can't lay eggs on the plants, and one doesn't get caterpillars eating the leaves of the plants. So it's an alternative to spraying cabbages with pesticides. So it reduces the cost of growing the crop, and it also produces a crop which is pesticide free, so safer to eat. Now, growing just to the left of that row cover, there's another crop there. This is a crop of soybeans. Fairly young soybeans, because they get rather large. So this is a May crop of soybeans you see here. And planting soybeans and other pea relatives in rows is another kind of a cultural practice that leads toward sustainable agriculture. So by growing pea relatives, the pea relatives have an association with them in the roots bacteria. The pea relatives have these structures in the roots called root nodules, which are home to a kind of bacteria that fixes nitrogen. So by growing these nitrogen fixing kinds of plants, one actually improves the concentration of nitrogen present in the soil. And nitrogen, of course, is one of the three big macronutrients that plants need to grow. So by planting these about in a vegetable farm and moving where they're planted from year to year, one can help to nitrify the soil without using chemical fertilizers. Still another practice that's just to the left of those soybeans. If you look carefully, you'll see that the surface of the soil is covered with grass. And in fact, every row in this vegetable operation has grass covering between the rows. This grass serves as a mulch, which keeps weeds from growing between the rows without use of chemical herbicides. But it also does some other things. It covers the soil with a protective layer that, especially in midsummer during the heat of July, for example, it helps to keep the soil from drying out and helps to hold in soil moisture by putting a barrier between the sun and the soil surface. Furthermore, when it's turned into the soil the following year, it helps to improve soil structure. That organic matter helps the water holding capacity of the soil, and as it breaks down, it releases nutrients back into the soil. All practices that eliminate the need for using so much chemical fertilizer and having to irrigate and other kinds of additives that would have to be bought to place in the garden. And on that note, I think we will end for today, and we will continue on with this topic of sustainability next time.